Following two ugly losses to Quinnipiac, the Siena men and women needed to decompress from the daily grind of practicing and playing basketball. Instead, they decided to give back to the community, something a sports team is no stranger to doing. They visited local area schools. Among the schools they visited included Voorheesville, as well as Blue Creek Elementary, which is located over in Loudonville.
I would say just stay curious and always ask questions.
Following that, they went over to a local food pantry and they did some bagging. They put some food inside the bags. You can see all of them collecting apples and stacking apples inside there. The Regional Food Bank of Northeastern New York, which made the visit over to Loudonville to talk about food donations. You could donate your non-perishable food items over to them to receive $5 off a ticket for a future Siena game. The Siena men and women were faced with another test, and that was against the two new members of the MAAC, Merrimack and Sacred Heart. Now, because of how the way the MAAC is doing things this year, not every team is going to play each other twice. And we got our first glimpse of that this week as the Siena men and women will play their only matchups against the Merrimack Warriors. The men have never played Merrimack before, but the women have, last year, in a game that ended in a Merrimack victory. But the men, well, they needed to get through Sacred Heart first, and same with the women. Following the ugly loss to Quinnipiac, the Siena men needed to rebrand themselves and find a way to get a victory in over Sacred Heart. And the game did not start out pretty. The Saints trailed the Pioneers for most of the very beginning of the game. They were still competitive now and then, but it was hard getting past leading scorer Tanner Thomas of the Pioneers, who had a career-high 30 points. The Pioneers led by as much as 12 at the very beginning, and it looked very similar to the Quinnipiac game at the very beginning, except the Saints were at least alive this time, and we did get some scores from Brendan Coyle, Major Freeman, Justice Schultz, as well as a career high from Devin Bradford, who was our player spotlight. Bradford once again continuing the dunks and continuing the abilities that he has playing center. At 7'1", he is the tallest player on the team.
And had you guys ready, and it was his idea to switch to the zone in the second half, which really changed things.
Thanks to Director of Operations Ryan Buery, the Saints switched to a zone defense. You know, what made Jim Boeheim famous. And it paid off. The Saints exploded in the second half, scoring their most points in regulation, which would be a season-high 54 points, to win 93-75. And unfortunately, there was a flagrant foul called on Sacred Heart, as well as a player fouling out that led the Saints to their victory. With 8 minutes left, tied at 65, Major Freeman hit a three-pointer. The Saints never looked back. And of course, Gavin Doty, gotta talk about him, because once again, Gavin Doty is trying his best to clean up whatever the other players leave behind for him. And he did just that. And one of the things I admired about the game was Brendan Coyle, Major Freeman, pretty much anybody that shot a three-pointer. When they didn't make the attempt at first, it was time for them to try again, and they would connect. As for Sacred Heart, one of their players is a former Siena student. His name is Aiden Carpenter. He played for Carmen Massarello for 2 seasons, and he was also the first player officially recruited by Carmen Massarello when he was coach. Carpenter actually enrolled at Siena mid-season in January of 2020, and he was already committed to play for Carmen Massarello, and then during COVID, he was on the team for 2 years. His career high was 15 on January 9th of 2022 against Fairfield. Overall, in his 2 years at Siena, he averaged 6.7 points, which is typical for an underclassman, but he wanted to be closer to home, being from Hampton, Connecticut, so he transferred to Sacred Heart, which was at the time part of the Northeast Conference. Carpenter was at the game, but he didn't play due to a foot injury. Another Sacred Heart player to highlight is Amiri Stewart, who is a senior over at Sacred Heart right now. He transferred from Wilmington University, which was a D2 school, and Justice Schultz, who played at a D2 school as well, faced off with Stewart the past 2 seasons when Lock Haven and Wilmington played each other. Currently, Schultz leads the series between the two players, 2-1. They split wins last year. And at the end of the game, Gerry McNamara put the walk-ons in. Not just Chris Torres, but Cooper Nadler joined them. Nadler, who was a player for Glens Falls last year and brought the Black Bears to one of their many, many state championships. At the end of the game, Chris Torres just dribbled the ball and ran the clock out, and the Saints were victorious. All right, to recap part of the game with me is Colin Caulfield, proud Siena student and proud Guilderland alum. Colin, what do you think?
Showtime Saints, they stepped up. Let's see, they had 6 guys play. Realistically, a couple guys got a couple seconds. And all those 6 broke double figures, except for one of them. 93 points. Defense wasn't there the whole game, but when they needed it, stepped up. And Gavin Doty, 1-4, man. I'd like to see him here for the next few years.
And what do you think Sacred Heart did wrong towards the end of the game?
They just didn't have a complete team. One guy went down with a bloody nose, another guy fouled out, and they were just, the lacrosse team got in their head, and the Siena lacrosse team, as a student section tonight, really showed up and just knocked them around.
And final thing is a shout out to fellow Gilderland alum Jess Saravillo, who graduated with Colin and goes to Sacred Heart now. Unfortunately, Jess, your team lost.
Sorry about that, Jess, but we're thinking of you.
And an interesting keynote, this was the first time in 50 years that Sacred Heart and Siena played each other, back when the teams were not even Division I yet. Meanwhile, for the women, however, they had had some recent history with Sacred Heart when they were part of the Northeast Conference. Their first time playing him was December 30th, 2009, when the Saints won 51-45 at a game in Loudonville. And then they went on a long series throughout most of the 2010s decade, until 2019, when the series was over. Siena was victorious that last game, 68-57. And the Siena women were headed back down to Fairfield, Connecticut, to the William H. Pitt Athletic and Convocation Center, where the Sacred Heart players play. And they won too, 79-59, the final score. Much like the men, the women shot 55% from the floor, single game high for them. The defense pretty much silenced Sacred Heart. Anijah Jackson, 19 points. Miriam Traore, 13 points. 8 points for Anaja Brown. 9 points for Anna Conde. And 21 points, once again, for the GOAT, Teresa Sapala. But our player spotlight's going to Miriam Traore because of this thing that she did right here towards the end of the first quarter.
Time for one more look for the Saints. They get the ball to Traore from half court. It would count! It's good! They will check it, but a half-court shot by Traore.
Half-court buzzer shot. How about that? This isn't just from the parking lot. This is from the nosebleed section. And the nosebleed section was perfect for a half-court shot that would make Elisa Mevius jealous. From there, the Saints went on a 7-0 run, bringing the total run to 17-0 until Sacred Heart had their first score in 9 minutes. At halftime, the Saints led 38-22, and then eventually the Saints just continued their run throughout the rest of the game. The Pioneers did also have a 20-point scorer as well. Nicera Pryor had 20 points, her 5th of the season. Nalise Dudley, 12 points. Emma Kirby, 10 points. And a career high for Amelia Wood, who had 6 steals. Now, this is the only Fairfield MAAC team that the Saints will be playing twice this season, because again, uneven schedules. The Fairfield Stags, which have been the longtime foe for the Saints, will only be facing against both of them once, and that will be in March. This was a great start for both teams playing against a new MAAC foe. They wanted to look good against them, and unfortunately for the Sacred Heart men, they are 1-8 on the road right now, which is among the lowest in the MAAC conference right now. And as for the women, well, this is something just like the men they needed badly because they want to stay in a comfortable 5th place. Right now, the Saints are in the top 10 in the MAAC. And if they can keep this position up, this is a very good thing. And it's important, especially when March comes around, because Siena's going to look hungry when they're stepping on the courts over in New Jersey. Oh, and Anaya Hooker's back. Hooker only had 2 points during the game and only played 10 minutes, but still, we all thought she was going to be out for a month, but seems like she's doing okay right now. And newcomer Pepe Loco, 5 points. So getting her first points on the board for the Saints, also a very good thing. Before we get into any details about the men's game against Merrimack, let's talk about their head coach. His name is Joe Gallo. He graduated from Merrimack in the class of 2004, and he is currently in his 9th season with the Warriors. In almost a decade at the helm, he transitioned the program to the Division I level, and he also brought them to 3 consecutive NCAA Division II championships from 2017 to 2019. Last week, Gallo amassed his 150th win against Sacred Heart, which was a gritty win, 66-65. Before that, he was the assistant coach over at Robert Morris and Dartmouth, and he also was the assistant coach at Merrimack. When the Warriors were part of the Northeast Conference, they made an immediate splash. In 2023, the Warriors were faced to be the #1 champion in the NEC, but that did not happen because they were still making the transition to Division I. winning just 1 point over Fairleigh Dickinson. They ended up bowing out. Fairleigh Dickinson went on that magical run where they beat Purdue. I actually hitched a ride up to Merrimack to go watch the Siena men play them up there, and joining me was my cousin Jeffrey with his thoughts on the game.
They did pretty good. Could have used some better defense, a little more aggressive offense, but overall, no complaints.
Also, shout out to my cousin Jeffrey because he allowed me to use his bedroom for this part of the video. Jeffrey is currently at his college. He goes to Wentworth Institute of Technology. He is studying electromechanical engineering. Not the biggest sports nerd. He pretty much just sat and played 2048 for most of the game, but he still found the game entertaining, and obviously, just like me, he thought the gym was very small. Still a close game. Siena could have easily have won this one, as they could have easily won some of their other attempts, but still they could not connect. The Saints lost 58-64. The last time the Saints played the Merrimack Warriors was actually their season opener in 1982 when John Griffin had his debut as coach. Remember, John Griffin was the last time Siena went 3-0 to start a head coaching tenure, and then Gerry McNamara was the second coach to do so. It was a very small gym. It was the smallest in the MAAC conference. Just over 1,000 attended the game, and that was because Merrimack was using their actual gym, Lawler Arena, for hockey. And it was pretty much the Adam Bud Clark effect. One of the leading scorers in the MAAC didn't really have much of the stats in the first half. He only had 2 points, but he then later got some more points later on. 50 points overall for the sophomore guard. Their leading scorer was Matt Becht. He had 18 points. And actually, Sean Trumper, one of the players on the team, fouled out towards the end of the game, which was a positive that the Saints were hoping to use for some momentum, but they could not do so. Another thing not in the Saints' favor were the absence of Peter Carey, who had an upper body injury. Carey, who is from Sunderland, Massachusetts, could not make the homecoming trip, and as a result, Devin Bradford starred in for the center. He mainly alternated with Miles Wilmoth, especially when he had 4 fouls. And the Saints did tie a few times. They tied at 47 at 13:22 to play in the second half. However, Merrimack went on a run that Siena could not get past. And the other thing was with Adam Bud Clark, Gerry McNamara played the zone defense throughout the entire game, trying to contain him, which the Saints were victorious in doing. Obviously, he only had 2 points in the first half, but the second half kind of got out of hand for him a little bit. I might as well bring it up now, but Adam Bud Clark is one of our players of the week for the men's side, alongside Will Sidner of Manhattan. Second time the two of them have been put together for a pairing. The previous week, Clark averaged 19 points per game in the 2 MAAC victories the Warriors had, and he also had 7 assists. Meanwhile, Will Sidner had 19 points as well as 7.5 rebounds, 1.5 assists, and 1.5 blocks. His career high was 27 points and 10 rebounds against Mount St. Mary's. Some other useless information for you. This was the first time Siena played Merrimack in Massachusetts in 49 years. This was also the first time Siena played a MAAC member from Massachusetts since 1990 when Holy Cross was part of the MAAC. That gym was absolutely a pigsty. It was impossible to navigate around without worrying that the dance team or any of the spectators walking by were going to get pummeled by basketball players. At one point, Gerry McNamara caught one of the basketballs that was loose and he threw it to the ground. But again, it just showed you how small the gym was. And also, this is where the commentators were seated. Like literally right in front of where one of my friends was seated. And Gerry McNamara said in an interview with the Times-Union that he was not happy that Siena wasn't going to be playing him again this season because, as I said before, and time again, this was the only time the Saints played Merrimack. Who knows, maybe they'll have a rematch against him in the tournament. The good news was at least the women were able to connect. Siena was looking for revenge following their loss to Merrimack last year, and they were able to do so, 58-79, the final score. The highlight, Anijah Jackson with 1,000 points in her career. Jackson, who's been with the team for 5 years, is now the 30th player to do so for the Siena women's team.
Syracuse Apollo goes into double figures. Baby Jackson has 1,000 points for her career.
Overall, this game, Jackson had 21 points. Meanwhile, Anijah Brown dominated the paint for the entirety of the game, 16 points, as well as 8 rebounds, 14 for Teresa Sapala. And the game highs for the Saints continued. They shot 59% from the field and 53% for the threes. That's not to say that Merrimack had a good game as well either, because they did. As a matter of fact, during into the second quarter, they were close to Siena by 3 points, but Siena went on a 10-2 run over them. The only Merrimack player who scored double figures was Talia Shepard, who had 16, Mia Fiore had 8, Paloma Garcia with 7, and Madison Roman 3. And interestingly enough, the Siena women played against 2 former MAAC rivals. Deja Jenkins, who is a graduate student, used to play at Manhattan. And Rose Queso, a redshirt junior forward, she used to play at Quinnipiac. And I might not have been at that game, but I guarantee you it would have been fun to watch, especially because it would have been interesting to see Jackson's celebration. But still, congrats on the player. She has done a lot of great, incredible stuff for the team, and I hope she goes out with a bang. Okay, time for a jam-packed men's MAAC report. There were 3 games this week, except for a few byes, because the game switched to Thursday, Saturday this week. Starting off with the Rider Broncs, who are on a hot streak right now. They won over Niagara 68-65. Mount St. Mary's winning 66-60. And surprise of all surprises, they beat Marist. Yeah, that's right. The top-seeded team in the MAAC is still no stranger to losing. Rider, which is not even the number 1 team in the MAAC right now, beat Marist 64-57. Meanwhile, Merrimack, before they played Siena, played Manhattan. The Jaspers lost to the Merrimack Warriors 62-69, and then Merrimack played Niagara and was victorious 72-65. For the 3 games St. Peter's had this week, their first was a win over Canisius, followed by a loss to Marist, and then a win over Sacred Heart. So Peacocks are starting to grow in MAAC competition. They were currently winless up until this point. Meanwhile, speaking of winless, Canisius, which had its most recent victory last week, got another one over Fairfield 78-67. They also lost to Iona 61-82. Aside from their losses to Canisius and Marist, Fairfield also played Niagara, beating them 70-66. And as for the Quinnipiac Bobcats, they're also on a winning streak. They had a 1-point win over Iona, but they also beat Merrimack in a top seed competition, 81-76, and then a big win over Mount St. Mary's, where they were victorious in the second half, 91-57. And what I will add about Mount St. Mary's is that the men are unfortunately on a downslide right now. Sacred Heart, they did win over them, but it was close, 73-71. And then, obviously, the losses to Rider and Quinnipiac. Niagara lost all 3 games. Iona had the split, and then Sacred Heart, they're also losing all 3 as well, so not a very good week for Sacred Heart either. On the women's side of things, they continued their normal Thursday, Saturday schedule. Rider playing Mount St. Mary's, losing 60-66, and then they also lost to Marist, 55-67. Manhattan women playing against Niagara, blowing them out 79-54. Niagara has not won a game since they won over Division II Bloomsburg earlier in the season. St. Peter's lost to Marist in a very low-scoring game. Holy crap. Only won 30 points that game. And they also won over Sacred Heart. Close one, 56-53. Another close win for the Canisius Golden Griffins. They beat Iona by 3 points. But then, no surprise, they lost to Fairfield 51-97. And aside from their blowout loss to Manhattan, talk about an even bigger blowout. Niagara losing by 47 to Fairfield at their Kids Day game. 96-49, the final score. The Quinnipiac women also had another surprise. They were just handed their second loss of the season. They did win over Merrimack, but in overtime, they lost to Mount St. Mary's 64-69. And the Mount St. Mary's women are going to host Siena next, so Siena better watch out. Obviously, we just talked about Merrimack losing to us. And as far as the rest is concerned, Jada Pierce and Niagara. Interesting downgrade from last season when they were the runner-ups to Fairfield in the MAAC tournament. And unfortunately, it's looking like they will probably be sparred this year. And as for the women, Gal Raviv once again getting a weekly award for Quinnipiac. You're looking at her stats right there. Joining her is Fatma Jana of St. Peter's. All right, let's look ahead to our next schedule for the week ahead. The Siena men and women once again playing games opposite each other, January 23rd and January 25th. First on tap, Mount St. Mary's, which is currently 11-5 right now overall on the season. The Mountaineers will be making the trip all the way up from Emmitsburg, Maryland, over to Albany, New York, to play against the Siena men. Meanwhile, the women head down to Emmitsburg to play against the women down there. Then, it's a rematch against Iona. Following the 1-point deficit loss to the Iona men, the Siena men will now face some revenge over in New Rochelle at the Heinz Athletic Center. Meanwhile, the Iona women head up to Albany to play at the UHY Center against the women. By the way, the Mount St. Mary's men are now coached by Donnie Lind. He replaced Dan Engelstadt, who left to Syracuse to replace Gerry McNamara. Interesting. All right, to close out the video, I'm going to show you guys a little bit of what I have to do when I'm at work. So if you look at the spreadsheet here, I have to update the player scores. So, for example, Teresa Sapala, she averages 18 points per game, 46% on the field goals, and 6.5 on the rebounds. And also Anaja Brown averages 7 points. That's just one of the things I have to update. There's Terry Primm with his record. Here's the roster. The upcoming schedule. Same goes for the men as well. Then we load them into the graphics, which are projected onto these TVs you see right behind me. We do not have another game again until January 25th, so until then we have a lot of time before we can set up these graphics. And likewise, here is Merrimack's roster. This was a roster I had to do last week when Siena played Merrimack. And just like that, it's the same thing, just with Merrimack stats. One stat that will have to wait is the record, because Siena women have to play a game before this one, so once we get the score from the Mount St. Mary's game, we'll be able to plug that in as well.